Imagine you're a lawyer defending someone on trial for murder. The prosecutor argues the defendant is guilty because he was seen running from the alley where the victim was shot and killed just minutes after the murder. But you know that your client didn't do it and was only running because he was scared after seeing the real murderer shoot the victim. Now you get up for your closing argument, and you are fully aware that if what you say next does not persuade the jury, an innocent person will be convicted. Summoning all of the eloquence you can muster, you say, "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, even if my client is guilty, he was not the only person at the crime scene." The jury seems confused. You try again. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, even if my client is guilty, he does not deserve a prison sentence." The jury is still confused, and you look over to your client. He's just shaking his head like you are a complete idiot. You start again, "Even if my client is guilty," and now the judge steps in and says, "Mistrial. Defense counsel is clearly incompetent, and the defendant needs a new lawyer." Now obviously this scene would never happen in real life, because you know that it doesn't make any sense to defend your client at trial by saying, "even if he's guilty." If you're trying to get your client acquitted, you wouldn't make an argument that begins by conceding his guilt. But did you know that on the LSAT, there's a certain kind of answer choice that appears on flaw questions that is just like a statement that concedes your client's guilt? In this video, I want to teach you about this kind of flaw answer and help you understand logically why it is never the correct answer on a flaw question. The answer I'm talking about is one that concedes your client's guilt, or to put it another way, it's an answer conceding that the conclusion of the flawed argument might be true. Usually it takes the form of fails to consider that even if the conclusion is true, or ignores the possibility that even if the conclusion is true. For example, let's say that we have the following flawed argument. Premise: people who eat cheese tend to suffer from heart disease at a higher rate than people who don't. Conclusion: therefore, eating cheese can promote the risk of heart disease. Now, this argument is flawed because the evidence establishes only a correlation between eating cheese and heart disease, but that correlation does not prove that cheese is what's causing the increased risk of heart disease. It's entirely possible that the people who eat cheese tend to eat other things that non-cheese eaters don't, like butter or chocolate or red meat, and that it could be one or more of these other things that raise the risk of heart disease. Cheese might be completely innocent here. So now we're asked what is a flaw in the argument above, and one of the answer choices says, overlooks the possibility that even if eating cheese promotes heart disease, there are other dietary factors that also contribute to an increased risk of heart disease. A lot of people taking this test might actually pick this answer because the second half of it sounds pretty good. That's the point that we were making earlier about potential alternate causes for the increased risk of heart disease. But this answer is definitively 100% completely, absolutely wrong because the first half concedes your client's guilt. It's conceding that the flawed argument's conclusion, that cheese promotes heart disease, might be true. And that's the exact opposite of what we're here to do. We want to point out why this conclusion might not be true. If we respond to the author of this argument with, sure, cheese might promote heart disease, well, they've already won because that's what they were trying to convince us of. The LSAT can make this answer even more tempting by just switching the order and saying overlooks the possibility that other dietary factors besides cheese can promote heart disease, even if cheese is one factor that promotes heart disease. This is the exact same answer, but because the tempting part of it is presented first, it might actually trick you. But of course, this answer is still wrong because this part is conceding that the flawed argument's conclusion might be true. Here's another way that they'll present this answer. They'll just make it more abstract. Fails to consider that even if one factor can contribute to a certain phenomenon, it may not be the only factor contributing to that phenomenon. This answer is wrong for the exact same reason. We don't want to concede that one factor can contribute to a certain phenomenon. That's a reference to cheese potentially causing heart disease. We want to explain why that factor actually might not contribute to heart disease, and that it's other factors that actually entirely explain the increased risk of heart disease. Now don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that any answer that uses the phrase even if is going to be wrong. I'm only calling out answers that say even if the conclusion of the argument is true. Let me give you an example of an answer that would be correct that uses the phrase even if. Imagine we have an answer that says, fails to consider that even if two phenomena are correlated, there need not be a causal relationship between those phenomena. Or another one that says, ignores the possibility that even if cheese eating is associated with an increased risk of heart disease, other dietary and lifestyle habits account for that increased risk. These answers would be describing a flaw because they're pointing out why, even if the premise part is true, the conclusion might be false. Notice that the even if part is conceding the premise, not the argument's conclusion. And the other part of the answer is pointing out why the conclusion could be wrong, not why the conclusion could be true. In other words, these answers are saying that the argument fails to consider that its premise doesn't automatically lead to its conclusion. And that is the textbook definition of what it means for an argument to be flawed. Let's take a look at another sample argument here. The proposed plan for escaping from our jail cell is likely to succeed. After all, it completely avoids all of the weaknesses of the prior escape plans. Now, the conclusion of the argument is that the proposed plan is likely to succeed, and the premise given is that it avoids all the weaknesses of the prior escape plans. Now, the flaw in this argument is that even if it doesn't have the old plan's weaknesses, it still might be unlikely to succeed because maybe it has new weaknesses of its own that make its chance of success lower than 50%. So now we're asked to pick an answer that describes a flaw in this argument, and we get one that says, overlooks the possibility that the proposed plan still has a high chance of failure even if it's likely to succeed. Or another one that says, fails to consider that even if the plan is likely to succeed, it should not be implemented. Or this one, ignores the possibility that the plan might have some weaknesses even if it's likely to succeed. All three of these answers are definitively wrong because they're all conceding the truth of the flawed argument's conclusion. They're all saying even if the plan is likely to succeed, but we want to show that the plan is not likely to succeed. So there is no reason for these answers to be under even the slightest consideration. But that raises the question, why are people sometimes tricked into these kinds of answers? Well, the first reason is that they don't identify or interpret the conclusion of the argument correctly. Notice that if you think the conclusion is that the plan will certainly or almost certainly succeed, then this answer is more tempting because it seems to be pointing out why there's still a large chance that it will fail. And if you think that the conclusion is that we should implement the plan, then this answer is more tempting because it's pointing out that maybe we shouldn't implement the plan. But those objections are irrelevant to the actual conclusion, which is just that the plan is likely to succeed. It might still have a high chance of failure, but the argument wasn't trying to say that it didn't have a high chance of failure. It's just saying that it's likely to succeed. And there could be reasons why we shouldn't implement the plan, but the argument wasn't trying to convince you that we should implement the plan. It's just saying that we are likely to succeed. Showing that there's a high chance of failure or that we shouldn't implement the plan do not go against what this conclusion is trying to convince you of. They're completely consistent with what this conclusion is saying. Now, another reason that these kinds of answers can be tempting is that sometimes part of the answer actually does seem close to describing the flaw that you anticipate. This answer does mention that the new plan might have new weaknesses, but it's still wrong since the other part concedes the argument's conclusion. Remember, an answer that is partially wrong is still wrong. So what would a correct answer to this flaw question look like? Fails to consider that even if the plan has none of the old plan's weaknesses, it may still have only a minimal chance of success. This answer concedes the premise, but shows that the conclusion might be false. It's saying even if the premise is true, that the plan does not have the old plan's weaknesses, the conclusion might be false, it might be unlikely to succeed, and we can take this idea of a minimal chance of success as being less than 50%. So the takeaway from this video is, if you understand the conclusion of the argument accurately, you can be confident that flaw answers that concede the truth of the conclusion are never, ever correct, because as a matter of logic, they're not pointing out why the argument is flawed. They're just like an answer that concedes the guilt of your innocent client. Check out these problems to see a few examples of this answer in real LSAT questions, and if you found this video helpful and want more like it, please hit the like button and subscribe to this channel.